end of chapter 15. Um, at the end of chapter 15, there was a disagreement between Paul and Barnabas, and they had been such good friends, and then they had this intense disagreement that got so bad that they split up and went different ways. And Barnabas went to the island of Cyprus, which was his home, and Paul took Silas and went off with him back up into central Turkey. And it's interesting that a division, and I could go probably on a sermon all the way just on that a division between two great Christian friends ended up producing something as wonderful as Paul's travels and his writings and the work that Barnabas did in Cyprus. It is so often that we feel as though disagreements and difficulties and arguments and things like that are so bad, and yet often it'd be nicer if we could do it in a gentle and loving way, say, okay, we just need to go separate ways. But a lot of times it's the argument that creates the tension that causes us to go separate ways. And God is able to do things through us apart from one another than more of a blessing than anything that he could have done with us together. So in Acts chapter 16, verse 6, Paul and Silas sensed that the Holy Spirit was blocking their way into Asia. Let me share with you the map again, as I shared last week, and we're talking about them starting down here in the bottom right-hand corner in Antioch and following this red line. Notice they went through Tarsus, which is where Paul was from. They went over into Derbe and Iconium and some of the places that they had been before. And then they headed up through central Turkey. And the places that they wanted to go were over here in Galatia and out in this area. And I have a feeling, just looking at this map, that Paul was sort of thinking that he would head up into what we now call Istanbul, cross over and get into this area, possibly going this direction. But in both cases, down here when they wanted to go off to Galatia, and up further when they wanted to go up into Bithynia, God said, no, I don't want you to do that. And timing is always critical in the midst of these situations. But let's read on here for a moment. Paul and Silas sensed that, verse 6 of chapter 16, that the Holy Spirit was blocking their way into Asia, so they continued to teach as they went through the regions of Phrygia and Galatia. They arrived in Mysia, thinking they might go from there into Bithynia, which would lead them up to that peninsula into Istanbul. But they felt the Spirit of Jesus directing them another way. They ended up in Troas. While there, Paul had a vision of a man from Macedonia standing before him and encouraging him to come over to that region and share the message of good news. Immediately, we looked for a way to cross over into Macedonia, knowing that it was God who was calling us to preach the good news to them. And I don't know if you noticed that, but in verse 9, it's what we call in English the pronouns of the third person. And in verse 10, it's the pronouns of the first person. So verse 9, Paul had a vision from a man who stood before him, calling him to come over. And then all of a sudden, verse 10 says, immediately we looked for a way to cross over into Macedonia, knowing that it was God who was calling us to that place. And so between verse 9 and 10 is when Luke, the author of this book, joins Paul, as best we can tell, and on goes the story from there. I think it's interesting that as Paul and Silas are going along in their path, they're thinking they want to go a particular way. They want to go uh, off to the right. They want to go off to the east. They want to go up to the north, and the Holy Spirit keeps directing them in a way that they wouldn't normally go, and so they can either be very frustrated with that, or they can say this is a positive thing that is happening. And they get into Troas, and Paul has this vision of a person calling them over to Macedonia. I think I've told you about this before, but I'm one of those people who thinks that God is there in the midst of our lives, causing doors to close so that other doors can open, so that we can be directed in His way. I went to the store last night. I was on the way to get something for dinner. I had my list to pick up because we had decided what we wanted for dinner. And I was rushing through the store to get back to the house to put everything together so we could have dinner. And I got to the store and I ran into somebody who delayed my hustle, if you will, and delayed it just long enough so that when I got home from the store and started to fix dinner, the phone rang, and it was a crucial phone call that my wife needed to take, and it took an hour long. Had I not been waylaid, if you will, and I could have seen it as a major frustration, by this person in the store, I would have gotten home in time for us to have fixed dinner and just sat down to have our meal when this phone call would have happened. So, we can look at that and we can say, oh, well, it was coincidence. It was a good coincidence. Or, as I have loved to look at it over the years, that was God entering into my life, and through the work of the Holy Spirit, bringing me in contact with somebody who I needed to talk to anyway, but it also delayed me long enough so that we weren't sitting around with a cold dinner when Linda got off the phone an hour later. I believe that that's God's timing. I believe that no matter what the experience is in our life, that we should be open to the fact that God could be causing great timing. I might have told you before, I had a prophetic word one day. Doesn't happen very often to me, but I called my friend Ralph. This was 40 years ago in seminary. I called my friend Ralph and I said, I've got a word for you today. You don't have to believe it, but this is the word for you. God doesn't want you to panic as you get ready for your job interview today, because things are going to get in the way. And I didn't know what I was talking about. I just knew what God was trying to tell me. Well, he relayed the story to me afterwards. He was on his way to a job interview in Los Angeles, which was about an hour away, or could have been 3 hours away in Los Angeles traffic. And he walked down in a reasonable amount of time to get comfortably to his interview. And the first thing he noticed was that his tire was flat on his car, and he would have to change the flat tire. The next thing he noticed was that the parking lot where he was living, where he had parked his car, was all blocked off because the pavers had come in to repave the roads outside the parking lot, and there was no way he was going to get out anyway. And once he did finally get out, he ran into traffic on the LA freeways, and there was just no way to get in touch with the people. I remember this was long before cell phones where you could just from your car make the phone call. He couldn't get in touch with them. He was late for the job interview. He ended up with not getting the job, and down the road getting a much better job. And he said to me afterwards, he said, had you not called me, had God not warned me, I would have spent that day in frustration and anger and anxiety because things were not working according to my plan. And you let me know that God had a different plan for me. And I think far too often we see the difficulties of our life, Paul and Silas not being able to go where they wanted to go, not being able to go where they wanted to go, being redirected, and all of those kinds of things, as God's way of bringing us into the right kind of timing so that we end up in the right place at the right time, and we can trust that God's timing is better than ours in the long run. So just want to encourage you. It might be a fault on my part to think that every time there's a delay in my life or a difficulty in my life, that there is a benefit from God. But in all the years that I have put my faith in Jesus and trusted that the delay in my life was really good, I have never been disappointed. My wife and I have gotten to a point where when things don't go our way, we just say, well, God, what's the adventure you have for us today? And that is kind of the backbone of how we approach things when they don't go our way. So I encourage you, if you are faced with difficulty this coming week, to ask Jesus for help. Help him, ask him to give you less anxiety. Ask him to give you confidence that he knows what he's doing. And also ask him to give you hindsight somewhere off into the future where you can look back on this moment and say, now I understand the benefit of having trusted and gone through that experience. I could go on because there's a whole lot more in this passage today, but I've put it all online. So there's a blog online if you want to go to the website bonniedunechurch.org and get to our blogs, the pastor's information, and Tom's going to put the whole text of this sermon online later on today. But I think that's enough of a message for us. Just thinking about our lives, of the difficulties that come our way, and they are many. And I think that I want to trust that God knows about those difficulties. And matter of fact, he even calls them in Ephesians chapter 2, verse 10, opportunities. I call them obstacles sometimes, but he calls them opportunities that he places before us so that we can grow to love him better, that we can love others more completely, and that we can demonstrate in the way we live our lives the goodness and the love and the mercy of Jesus Christ in all that we do. So I just encourage you along those lines today, and I bless you with the faith to see his presence in the midst of your situation, no matter what your situation is, and to feel that his loving arms are around you. Why he does what he does, when he does it, I don't always understand. But the fact that he is there to walk through that pain with me is just a blessing. And seeing that, I believe I walk out the other side of that pain with a fresh and whole perspective that allows me to trust that God knows best, even though the situation that I've gone through has been difficult. So bless you with the faith to see His presence in your life and to feel His loving arms around you. Let's turn to